Let's study the grid we created in a little more detail. The first column shows the command that starts up the application. So that column represents a command. Now every time we activate a cell in that column, we will start up the application. Now we only need to do that once at the very beginning, so you notice that that is only being activated on the first row. Next we have the objects that we had learned. There was a set of these objects. We had the increment, the decrement button, and the counter text box. Now these are objects that we created at the very beginning. Now notice that we have created a few cells here too. Now in the increment and decrement button we can see the action. Action means clicking on it, and so we are able to simulate a click on those buttons by simply picking action from the drop-down box on these columns. Next we can take a look at the expected values columns. This is where we enter the value that we would expect to see at the text box at every row. Now it was 0 in the first case, 1 in the next, and 0 and 0 again. Another column is the read counter value. Now this column is used to read the value out of the text box into the implicit variable called generic string, which we're displaying right next to it. So the value read from the text box is really just a display where we're displaying the value. This is so we can read what we actually saw. So for instance, if something really went wrong in our script, we could always read that value and say, well, we decremented, but the value didn't change, for instance. And we also have a column for comparing the expected and the real counter value. Now we consider it to be a failure in the script unless the two values compare. That is the value in the expected value column and the value in the value read from text box column. So basically that column, compare expected versus real counter value, is our comparison, our little check to make sure that the application has done what it's supposed to do. So this total script makes up basically a sequential set of actions. Now the first thing we did was to start the application. That is the row 1, column 1. So that's basically the activation of the start app command. Then the second thing that happens is that we set the expected value to 0. Then the third thing is we read the value from the counter text box to the generic string. And notice all I'm doing is I'm reading out which cells have been populated. So number 4, what would that be? Well, obviously we're reading the value from the text box and we're displaying it in the output column, that is the value read from text box. Then we compare the two values. If it fails, we have failed. Number 6, notice we didn't do anything on start app on row 2, so the next action, that is the 6th action, is to increment. This is to click on the increment button. Then we set the expected value to 1, then we read the value again, we display it in the grid. You see here that when we executed the value was 1, and then we compare to make sure that it is 1, and it compares fine. Then the next step is to press the decrement button, and we've done that by enabling the action in the column decrement on row 3, and then we move on like this. So anyway, that is how it all works, and this is how a script is done. And we could do 13, we could do 14, we can do 15, and it would execute through. We do have a view. If you remember, we do have the scenario view that allows us to display the full set of steps nicely. So here we see they're broken down by scenario. Check initial value, we discussed earlier, there was the happy path, and then we have the check for negative values. In this lesson, we've taken a look at SmarteScript using a breadth-first approach. I basically created a full test suite or a test script to show you how SmarteScript works as a test automation tool. The process was we first learned the objects under test. This, if you remember, was a very simple process, and we're going to come back to that in the next lesson. Then we simulate the user by defining what the user should do at various points in time, and then we weave in various checks to determine the success or failure of the application. Now the main advantage of SmarteScript here is the very easy to use interface using the grid and a rich set of commands that allows you to do anything you want to do to a UI application.